Hi, and welcome to the final lecture of the Cat and Dog series. In this series, we have been asking one basic question: is life about us, or is life about God? Are we the main character of the Bible, or is God the main character? To start our final lesson off, I want to talk to you about a hobby of mine. When I was first married, I took up the hobby of woodworking. I bought some used tools and began to build some small items. As time went on, I started to dream about building something really big. My dream was to build a roll-top desk. I had always wanted one but could never afford one. So I began to dream one up in my mind. I envisioned large drawers and lots of little cubby holes to put things in, and eventually I began to work on it. Since I had no plans, it kind of evolved. And one night, my wife came down to the basement in our house and saw me working on the drawers on each side and said, "Honey, if you were to sit down in a chair, you'd be working like this." And I realized, she's right. I had run into a problem, but I quickly overcame it by dropping down the middle area where you would actually do your writing. I finally finished the desk, and it now sits in our master bedroom. I want you to know that I had a blast thinking that desk up and building it. I love being creative. Thinking through the design and then building the desk brought me great joy. As I have grown in life, I have realized more and more that the creativity that I have has been given to me by God. And that has come to me because I was created in the image of God. And if I am creative, God must be creative. And if I had fun building my little desk, God must have had a blast making creation. Dogs are sensitive to this because dogs keep asking the question, what does God get out of this? Looking at creation and asking that question changes the way you read your entire Bible, especially the very first chapter of Genesis. In our live seminars, we usually start off a seminar by reading Genesis chapter 1 straight through. We tell our audiences that this is where we find cat theology first. And every time we read through the chapter, we get typical responses. People begin to look puzzled. A little later, they get a little fidgety. Then they start to look out the window and they kind of check their watches, and then they check their cell phones or text somebody or whisper something to another person. All in all, they are communicating one simple thing. They're bored. Why? Why are most Christians bored with Genesis chapter 1? Well, we've asked that question to our live audiences and gotten back answers like, well, we've heard it before, we're very familiar with it. Some might say, well, we're not exactly sure if it's completely true. But none of those are the real reason. The real reason most believers are bored with Genesis chapter 1 is due to a very simple fact, and that fact is this: people are not there. We, the main character, are not there. And if we are not there, it can't be very good now, can it? Most evangelicals don't get excited about the Bible until Genesis chapter 3. Why? Because at least then mankind sins and we have something to live for, a rescue operation. Genesis 1 and 2? Boring. It's head knowledge. Not very good. And what we have non-verbally communicated to God is that the Bible, this book, is really all about us. And if we're not in it, must not be very good. Remember, dogs study theology, cats study meology. Theology asks one question: what does God get? Meology asks a different question: what do I get? And if you read Genesis chapter 1 while asking the question, what do I get? It's no wonder the entire chapter is boring. We are basically not there. It's not about us. We do appear in the last few verses of the chapter, but we're simply a footnote at the end. Cats have missed something key in the book of Colossians. Let's look at the end of Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 again. All things were created by Him and for Him. Dogs know that all things were created for God. Everything. The stars, the clouds, the trees, the fish, the oceans, the mountains, everything was created for God. So dogs ask, what does God get when reading the Bible? And this applies to the book of Genesis as well. They ask, what does God get out of Genesis chapter 1? And when you do that, the chapter comes alive. In fact, dogs can't get out of a chapter. They love it. They imagine the joy, the creativity God must have had in thinking up creation. Let's look at the beginning of the Bible, the very first chapter, and see what God is getting. In the beginning, God created. Stop right there. God created. What's so exciting about that? Nothing. If you're worried about yourself. Everything. If you know how exciting it is to create, and if you realize that God had to have been creatively thinking about it before He even began to create. God didn't just say, be, and it came together, and then God said, cool. I never would have thought that up. No. God had to think it all up before He said be. And what kind of things did He have to think about? Everything. He had to have asked Himself the question, will things be purely spiritual or should they be material? And if they are material in nature, should they be made up of matter or antimatter? And will all things be alike or should there be different materials? And should those materials be visible or invisible? Should they be organic or inorganic? And should I make them big or small, smooth or rough, soft or hard? Should they be a liquid, a solid, or a gas? And should they be static or moving? And if they do move, should they be fast or slow? And He also had to determine, should there be light or darkness? And if there is light, should it just be black and white or should there be colors? And if colors, how many? And will there be a cause and effect relationship to things? Will there be laws that govern the universe, or should everything just be random? And should things be self-sustained or not? Should they grow and reproduce or simply be static? And if I'm going to start something, that means there's a beginning, so should there be an end? And if so, how long should things exist? All of this and a trillion things more had to be thought through. And God must have had a blast thinking through all of this in His infinite wisdom. How long did it take? Who knows? But He had eternity past to think through it. And eternity to dream up what He wanted to create. And then think through problems that would have come up and then solve those problems. Just as I had to think through my desk, God thought through creation. And we want to suggest to you that He must have loved it. Let's keep on reading in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens? When God spoke, He created the heavens. And in all of His decisions to make, one of the big decisions He had to think up was big or small. He decided big. How big? Our sun is one star in the Milky Way galaxy. The next nearest star to us is 4.2 light years away, which means if we were to travel at the speed of light, roughly 300 million meters per second, or 186,000 miles per second, it would take us, traveling at that speed, 4.2 years to get there. Our galaxy contains around 100 billion stars. It is 100,000 light years in diameter. Its arms rotate around the center at 750,000 kilometers per hour, or 465,000 miles per hour, and it takes 240 million years to make one revolution. And the Milky Way is only one galaxy. There are somewhere between 200 to 300 billion galaxies, each containing billions of stars. What a God! What a creator! What a powerful, almighty God who is infinite in power, who thinks big. What a blast He must have had. Yet while He was thinking big, God also thought, I'll show my glory off by making things small as well. The universe is made up primarily of hydrogen. 90 to 99% of the universe is hydrogen. Hydrogen is made up of atoms. Atoms are 0.000000001 meters across. That's 1/10 millionth of a millimeter in diameter. That is pretty small. But a hydrogen atom is made up of a proton and an electron. A proton is 1/100,000th of an atom, and an electron is 1/100 millionth of an atom. To put this in perspective, if you were to blow up an atom so large that its edges reach to the moon and to the earth, making it 254,000 kilometers wide or 158,000 miles wide, the proton would be the size of a golf course, and an electron would be the size of a golf ball. That is very, very small. God, wanting to show off His glory, thought, I don't have to decide between big and small. I'll make both big and small. And beyond displaying His creativity, God also sees it and enjoys it. Imagine God looking into the universe. It only takes the Hubble telescope and their public domain pictures to catch a tiny glimpse of what God sees. What do you think He is thinking when He looks at the giant nebula, the Milky Way galaxy? Is He zooming in on an individual stars? Is He saying, that one's named George. Oh, look, there's Pugiati. And that one's Marshni. Or is He seeing it from a distance and saying, oh, it's beautiful. Look at the gases. Look at the stars. Look at the coloring. Remember, just because we do not see it doesn't mean it isn't there, and doesn't mean that God isn't watching it right now and enjoying it. It was created for Him, not for us. He is enjoying it just as much as He is enjoying us. And right now, this very instant, He may be enjoying what we call the Eagle Nebula or the Helix Nebula. Or He might be looking at different close-up views of everything. We've barely touched the joy God must have in His universe. But this lesson can only last 20 minutes, so let's skip over to verses 9 and 10. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters He called seas. What pleasure did God have in making the dry land and the seas? Let's just focus on the seas. The oceans occupy nearly 71% of our planet's surface. More than 97% of all of our planet's water is contained in the ocean. The oceans provide 99% of the Earth's living space, the largest space in our universe known to be inhabited by living organisms. And less than 10% of this living space has been explored by humans. And more than 90% of this habitat exists in the deep sea known as the abyss, where water pressure at the deepest point is more than 8 tons per square inch, the equivalent of one person trying to hold 50 jumbo jets. And God has creatures living down there surviving quite well. And in one small drop of water, there are thousands of small creatures called paramecium. Paramecium have 20 different sex types, and they multiply every 3 hours. Talk about creativity. In fact, if one were left to multiply on its own and never be destroyed, in 5 years, it would solidly pack all known space. The ocean is one of God's greatest achievements in the universe, and we can't even exist there or explore 90% of it. Why? It's there for God to enjoy, not us. There's so much we're not even talking about, and yet so much to discover in this chapter. Let's skip down to the first part of verse 20. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures. Let's just try to imagine the joy God must have had in simply creating and coloring the fish. Imagine God reaching out and grabbing clay out of nowhere, with waves crashing at His feet from His newly formed ocean. He then flattens the clay down and begins to make His first fish, pinching out some clay and putting on the fins. And then the master gets out his paintbrush and he begins to paint. And he says, I'm going to make this baby yellow. And then he might have said, now I think I'm going to add some white stripes to it. Now, how about a little black around the stripe? And then he looked at it more and said, something's missing. I think I'm going to add some blue around the edges. And then he looked at it and he said, it's beautiful. Then he breathed life into it and put it in the water, and it swam away. And God said, yes! Ha! That was so much fun. I'm going to do it again. Hey, Spirit, come here. You got to try this. And so the Spirit got some clay out of nowhere, made it a bit rounder and flatter, and said, I think I'm going to go with a basic white with black dots. Kind of have it a bit mellow. And he loved it. And so he said, Jesus, get over here. You got to try this. It's great. Okay, Jesus said, I think I'll make mine various shades of brown. Let me think here. How about white stripes and I'll put some black fins and dots on it, and I'll give it lots of tentacles. And then God thought outside of the box and he said, let's make something called the jellyfish. He said, it won't have any heart, won't have any brains, no bones or eyes, and its body will be over 95% water, and I'll give it tentacles for catching its food. And I'll have it move by propulsion and give them different colors, making them all elegant in the water. And then he made the sea dragon and decided to have the male carry the babies instead of the females. Oh, how the angels must have given God a symphony of praise when they saw his glory put on display. And we've only looked at half of verse 20 and barely touched the surface of God's creativity in the water, but there's so much more in this chapter. Let's look on at verse 24. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds. Oh, the joy God must have had in creating a hummingbird to flap its wings 90 times in a second, to have all the monarch butterflies travel thousands of miles to a common place they've never seen before, to make a giraffe with its long neck, to have the falcon fly 160 kilometers per hour to catch its prey, to have the peacock show off its feathers, to give the walrus tusk the moose antlers, or to have a spider weave its very first web without ever having gone to school or seeing an example. God's glory has been put on display all around us, and God is having a blast watching it all perform exactly as he designed it. How awesome are his works. How indescribable is what he has done. Now, will man's achievements ever come close to God's display of his glory? No way. Not even close. Did you know that the amount of energy it takes to evaporate water from the earth, have it rise and condense, and then fall back to the earth in one day in the form of rain, takes more energy than man will ever create? Did you know that there are more stars than all the grains of sands in the entire world? And he has every one of them named. Did you know that the large redwood trees lift tons of water each day to the top, defying gravity? And the common flea has 50 times the acceleration speed of the space shuttle. The intricate designs of the Master will always be beyond compare. And when we have eyes to see the joy he is experiencing in his creation, we'll cry out with the psalmist, may the glory of the Lord continue forever. The Lord takes pleasure in all he has made. The Lord takes pleasure in all he has made. The Lord has pleasure. This is why at the end of each day he said, it is good. God takes pleasure in his creation. And if God has pleasure in it, why shouldn't we? we too can have joy in the works of God's hands. Well, we are at the end of this series. Hopefully you have learned a great deal and are beginning to change the way you think about God, about life, about everything. We are hoping this is the beginning of permanent life change. And if there's any one thing we want you to walk away with from this series, it is this: life. It's not about us. It is about God.